of Tech Asia, a YouTube channel with almost 23,000 subscribers. With more than 1 million views, this channel serves to showcase his extensive factory field work in China and how businesses can better work with factories. He's the founder of RiceBox.com, a China risk management consulting company based in Hong Kong, and a co-founder of China Sourcing Academy, a complete training system for professional buyers seeking to source from China. He's also the founder of the China Supplier 1000 project that focuses on helping suppliers to develop their international business. As you can see, he is very well sought after and has been a keynote speaker at more than 200 industry and academic conferences across the globe. He's a best-selling case study author, a teaching and innovator, and one of the top 10% of business faculty teaching at 3 different universities. He has been nominated for Teaching Excellence Awards at 5 different occasions, showcasing his accomplishment as an established educator. Let's welcome Professor Neil O'Connor. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, and appreciate the platform with AICPA and CIMA.
We can't hear you, Professor.
Thank you so much, and appreciate the platform with AICPA and CIMA. I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to get straight into it. And I really want to have a great dialogue with you, especially questions. Some of you may think, well, you know, enough with the macro stuff, I want micro stuff. So we can cover macro and micro tonight. Micro meaning, okay, what does a company do on the ground in a factory today to deal with its costs? You know, I'm a cost accountant, management accountant is my major teaching in the accounting discipline, so I know where many of the members are coming from. But at the macro, I just want to describe some of the things that's going on, and many of you are reading, not a day goes by when there's something associated with impacts on supply chains. Now, you know, we've got economic problems with interest rates going up, and we've got war, trade war, we've got inflation, we've got a lot of things going on. But at the end of the day, we want to think, how does that impact on supply chains? And what I'm going to document is really not a consensus of all the news press that I have read, but really the data on hundreds of companies that are decentralizing in the region. And so that's what I'm about to show you tonight. So I'm more interested in let the data do the talking rather than me do the politicking. And I've always, you know, I've spent 20 years in Hong Kong, so, you know, I love China. So this is not an anti-China talk at the same time, because if we talk about all of the companies that sourcing shift out of China, very few of them are leaving China. This is not a close up China story. This is a decentralization story, and it really started back with the Trump policy in the trade war, but it gained more leverage when the pandemic came along. There were border closures and there was much more uncertainties going on. And, you know, a simple framework here was there's uncertainty that causes strategic reevaluation of, oh, we are sourcing from 5 countries. Why are we in country 1? Why are we in country 2? Why are we in country 3 and 4? Why are we in China? And so it really caused a reevaluation. Why are we in where we are with our global footprint? And for the large multinationals, they have the luxury of saying, well, you know, we are, by being multinational, our global footprint is global, so we're not going to change how we are going to go. We're just going to maybe shift our orders from one country to the other, like what a lot of the footwear companies have done. Nike, they just moved, say, 10% of their order capacity in China, which went down from 30 down to 20%, to their 160 contract manufacturers in Vietnam. And so, you know, multinationals have the luxury of be able to shift orders within 1 week. SMEs, startups, they don't have that luxury. Often for them, it's we need to move from one country to another. And so there are different decisions depending on how large the company is. And so I've mapped it out in this diagram here, but I want to show you some of the data. This is what we've documented. And when I say documented, we've looked at all of the annual reports and publicly documented quotations by C managers of all of these companies from 2017 all the way up until 2020 on decisions made about moving, decentralizing from China to other countries. And as you can see, you've got 45 American firms in that sample, only 5 of which are closing up in China. And even one of them was Harley Davidson. They were in the process of setting up a factory north of Shanghai, and they didn't even get it run at rate, and they decided, oh, we're not going any further, we're moving to Thailand, and that's what they did. So it's really interesting. 5 out of 45 are closing up in China. So this is not a moving out of China and let's forget China strategy. This is a decentralization strategy that I am documenting. Fortunately, Southeast Asia is a big beneficiary, and of that, Vietnam, with 70 moves out of 132 going to Vietnam. And if you look at the top 5 countries, you've got Chinese Taipei, you've got Vietnam, India, Mexico, and USA as the large recipients of a decentralized moves by these companies. If we look at the location of the country headquarters, as I said, and this is, there's 2 numbers I want you to think about. There's 132 companies that we are talking about, but those 132 companies have decided to move to 232 countries. So what does that mean? It means that some of these companies have decided to, okay, we're going to move some capacity out of China. We're not only going to go to Vietnam, we're going to go to India, and we're also going to go to Indonesia, and we're going to go to 1, 2, or 3 countries, just like what Hasbro did. They moved capacity out of China. They went to India, Vietnam, and Mexico, and they're also thinking about reshoring in USA as well. And so that's why the country moves is always going to be much larger, in this case, nearly double the number of companies that we are documenting. Industry types, electronics dominates, followed by footwear, household, and auto. As you can see, sports, not so much, but definitely the footwear and clothing dominated a lot. The data relocation from 2018 to 2023. So what I want to show you is some interesting insights. There is the data, but Neil, don't just show us the data. What does the data mean? Okay, here is the first bit of meaning I want you to take away. When we decentralize, it's very easy to decentralize like what Nike did, and that is they just move order capacity from their contract manufacturers in China to Vietnam. So it's just a matter of ringing up their contract manufacturers in Vietnam and say, look, we want to expand our capacity. We're already working with you. We've already trained up the teams. Maybe they just have to add on more lines in that contract manufacturer for their major customer, Nike. And that's basically a very easy approach to take. And we would call them red moves. That is, you're going to a red ocean. You're going to a country where you're already operating. So there's no uncertainty with that kind of move. On the other hand, if you're going to Vietnam for the first time, or Malaysia for the first time, or Indonesia or India for the first time, then we call them blue moves. So out of the total, we can see that 1/3 of the moves are for a country for the first time, whereas 2/3 are to countries where multinationals are already operating. And so what does that's one meaning I want you to take away. And next meaning I want you to take away from the data is that China really cannot be replaced by a single country. So if we're going to move 10% of our capacity out of China, that's a pretty huge capacity if you're a Nike or Adidas or some other footwear manufacturer. And that's a big capacity. And so it's not surprising to find that out of the 232 country shifts, you've got many of those shifts being 2 country moves, 3 country moves, 5 country moves, 4 country moves, and only 74 out of the 232, 1/3, are single country moves. So that's really explains how big China is playing in as the global factory. China still will be the global factory. Vietnam, a population less than 100 million, is 1/14 the size of China's population. So it's very hard to think that Vietnam could replace China as the next world's factory. Even India, yes, India is growing, and I'm going to show you in the next 5 or 10 minutes how India has started to get some of this sourcing shift capacity. But that's the first thing I want you to take away is 1/3 of these moves are going to a country for the first time. That has policy implications, say, for example, Malaysian government, Indonesian government, Vietnam, Thailand government, for thinking about how can they attract customers, FDI, to the country for the first time, rather than just expand the already capacity of customers, FDI, that are already in your country. And so we're looking at, we can actually strip away the number of country moves or the number of company moves and look at it in terms of equivalent people moves. Basically, we're documenting nearly 750,000 of factory capacity among those 230 countries that these 132 companies have sourcing shift to. And so what does that mean? Well, it really means that in terms of average people capacity move, India dominates in terms of the size of the moves, whereas Vietnam dominates in terms of the number of companies moved. So Vietnam dominates in terms of a lot more small sourcing shifts, whereas India is the recipient of moves by larger multinationals. And that could be for a number of reasons. Number one, it takes a larger footprint of a multinational to move to India than it does to move to Vietnam, maybe because of government policy, maybe because of the need for more resources to set up shop in India. And also there's a greater challenge when it comes to the logistics of getting things from A to B in India that only a multinational could manage. Whereas in Vietnam, much more amenable to a SME moving to versus a large multinational. Of course, Vietnam has both. So it's really interesting that we see different horses for courses. Different countries have different attractions depending on how large the multinational is. If they're an SME, more likely they're going to Vietnam than to India. Interesting, if we have a look at this is a Sankey diagram that just shows, different industries going to different countries, and without confusing you too much, if we look at generally what we've got here is electronics is dominating, Vietnam is dominating. But if we look at the trend over time, initially, yes, electronics was dominating, and initially footwear was an early mover between 2018 and 2019. But more recently, footwear has dropped off, household has started to expand, auto is continuing, electronics is continuing, and clothing has started to expand. And as you can see, there has been more countries have become recipients that weren't recipients in the early stages. So you could say the second term was more the pandemic era, and we can see that Thailand continuing, but Mexico receiving more, India continuing to receive, but then you've got other countries like Brazil starting to register as a recipient, and Cambodia. So there's other countries starting to come into the foray of being recipients of this supply chain shift. And so if we look at where to move, and here we have the multi-country brands, and just as I'm on it, this is all data taken from public statements by C managers and also quotes, forward-looking statements in annual reports. 90% of these companies are publicly listed companies. And so you might say, well, yeah, Neil, that's all great, but what about the hundreds of other companies that are private and never talk about moving? Well, that's obviously a limitation and data that we did not have access to. So getting back to the red moves and blue moves, as you can see, Vietnam was recipient of both. Even Malaysia was recipient of both, 5 and 4, Vietnam 41 to 29. And so again, government policy, you need to think. Existing customers, you need to look after, because you don't want to lose your existing customers. New customers, this is where you need to think about how can you roll out the red carpet so you can get FDI from new customers. And so that's a government policy takeaway from this data. And we can see that, yes, red moves did dominate for the Philippines, for Thailand, for Vietnam, for Indonesia and Malaysia. But notice that India is getting a lot more blue moves. And so this is a really interesting contrast, that India is a more recipient of blue moves versus Southeast Asia. And a lot of those blue moves are from large multinationals. Like in the last 2 years, Apple just doubled their sourcing footprint from India from 3.5% to over 6.5% of its global supply chain footprint. Of course, Apple's moving to Vietnam as well, announcing that they're setting up their manufacturing for the first time of the iWatch. So, Apple is benefiting both India, Southeast Asia at the same time, being a multi-country sourcing footprint. As you can see here, if we look at the multiple moves, notice that and this is reshoring here, because there's a lot of news articles of, okay, reshoring is the answer. No, not really, because we've only documented 36 firms out of the 132 that are reshoring. Of course, Chinese Taipei, Japan, South Korea, obviously recipients of reshoring, because each of those governments gave incentives to their home country multinationals to bring their supply chains back home. And especially for Japan and South Korea, they had huge xenophobic risk. Hyundai basically closed up their vehicle manufacturing in China. Like, just Japan and South Korea had huge xenophobic risk, being subject to a lot of attack whenever there was something politically damaging about China in Japan or South Korea. In Japan, when they visit the shrine, in South Korea, when US set up an anti-missile defense arrangement in South Korea back in 2019. So all of these things have caused the reshoring for Japanese and South Korean companies. So if we look at specific countries, I just want to give an added nuance and quickly go through some of these. One is Vietnam isn't Vietnam. That is, a lot of the sourcing to South Vietnam is different to North Vietnam. North Vietnam, and very much more like what is happening to India, being recipients of larger multinationals and electronics like India, whereas South Vietnam, much more the sportswear, footwear, apparel industries. Vietnam overtaking Bangladesh in 2019 as the second largest footwear and apparel exporter in the world after China. So, amazing feats that Vietnam is going through in terms of its development on the global sourcing stage. If we look at the companies that already established in Vietnam. As you can see, a lot of footwear and clothing apparel companies are already in Vietnam. So 17 USA companies, Gap, Under Armour, Nike, and you can see, Puma and Adidas. That's not surprising. But what is surprising is here are the newly established companies going to Vietnam. And as you can see, Apple going to Vietnam and expanding, setting up a footprint for the first time in the last 3 years, and obviously getting Foxconn as their major contract manufacturer in Vietnam. If we look at Taiwan, notice dominated by red, so therefore it's like a come home strategy and the incentives were there. Same for Thailand. A lot of moves to Thailand were red. In other words, you're already set up in Thailand, then it's easier to move to Thailand. Mexico in the same way. Yes, there's a lot of news, let's go to Mexico. Let me assure you, a lot of representatives, Southeast Asia tonight, Malaysia. The good news is Mexico is not really a competitor to Southeast Asia. Mexico has a lot of barriers to entry, culturally, skill set wise, in many ways. There's a lot of barriers to Mexico. Even when I talk to the global supply chain manager of VF Corp that makes 150 million jeans per year, they still just run their 5-pocket variety out of Mexico. Why? Because it's easy to run a factory in Mexico with a low skill set. But for their more expensive and new design categories, they're basically still sourcing from Vietnam, Bangladesh and China because they can manage a higher skill set in those countries. So that's the good thing that Southeast Asia still has going versus Mexico. And of course, I need to put in USA there. India, it's a great news story for India, and it's coming of age in terms of a lot of encouragement to set up the ecosystem and the logistics system, which really has challenged India for the last 2 decades, getting stuff from A to B, getting things to port. Yes, India sees their logistics as a huge challenge. India having a TU capacity that's equivalent container foot capacity, 20-foot container foot capacity of about 10 million TEUs per year, the same as Malaysia, same as Vietnam, compared to China, 170 million. But India has the opportunity to expand that over the next decade, and that's probably partially why you see Apple going there. That's why you see a lot of these electronics going to India for the first time. And so when they go there, that would help to accelerate their logistical footprint that they need and their ecosystem that they need to come of age in terms of a real competitor to China in the electronics sourcing. So that's going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years. And we cannot have this talk without mentioning Indonesia. Huge opportunity, and you can see the apparel manufacturing is expanding in Indonesia, but Indonesia is challenged with its isles, the islands, the thousands of islands that it has, and that's something that Cambodia doesn't have, Malaysia doesn't really have. So Malaysia needs to take advantage of this. And like one great thing that Malaysia has had for the last 2 decades is, and you all know, and that was, what's the big brand name that Malaysia has been successfully, you go to shopping centers, you go to the Garden Mall and there is a shopping center, there is a brand name store of a factory based in Johor. What is the name of that brand? Come on, you all know that. Come on, participation, everyone. Come on, we've got a lot of Malaysians in the audience tonight. Come on, you all know Dyson, don't you? right? Dyson never manufactured in China, it manufactured in Johor. And so this is something that Malaysia needs to celebrate. And one great thing is Bissell, which is the oldest vacuum cleaner manufacturer in the world. It is still private, over 125 years old, mind you. And more, back in the late 1880s, I think it was founded. And they have moved to Johor. So, these are the things that will help improve Malaysia's footprint as a recipient of more of these sourcing shifts. Both Penang has the opportunity to expand more and it can compete on a level footing with Thailand, and then you've got Johor, which can obviously compete, as shown by Dyson being there, Vissel being there, and it's just a matter of the policies in Malaysia being more proactive to attract this type of FDI. Great stuff. So we needed to mention Malaysia tonight. As you notice, no surprising, Japan, it's red moves. No one goes to Japan for the first time. This is a result of the government having its own sourcing strategy of incentivizing its major brands to bring their sourcing footprint back home from China. Philippines, there you go. So there are, as I said, electronics is dominating, household, industrial, auto. Obviously, they dominate industrial, also auto and electronics, basically dominating in terms of consumer electronics, and it's really a B2B sourcing shift that we see. And down at the bottom, clothing and footwear being dominated by those large apparel companies. Okay, last thing I want to show you in terms of this sourcing shift, then I want to get micro and then we can get into some question time. And that is the reasons for sourcing shift out of China. And it's not only enough for me to say, oh, look, this is what's going on, let the data do the talking, but we want to know why. And we can talk about internal drivers, industry drivers, or external or environmental drivers. There's all these different ways, and let this not be a theoretical, boring, and a non-application talk by a university professor tonight. I want to bring real-world industry stuff to you. And this is the reasons across 132 firms, and we have got 698 citations of why are they moving capacity from China to another country. And as you can see, geopolitical risks, the increase in tariffs are tending to dominate. Of course, human rights issues, not so much. But let's have a look at the issues from China. Is this a push thing going on? Yes and no. If we add that up, issues from China add up to about, 1 quarter, 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. And again, incentives from the receiving country market adding up to about 1 quarter, 7 plus 6 plus 6 plus 5. But look at that, the cost of the land, production, labour and taxes from China. But if we look at the incentives from the receiving country, it's scope to improve the supply chain. It's being close to the market, or cheaper land and labour, or tax incentives. So if I was talking to governments, I would appeal to the governments in Southeast Asia to roll out the red carpet and make sure that you have tax holidays to attract FDI. Make sure that you have scope to improve the supply chain, and you don't just attract a factory being built, but the factory cannot get labour to the factory, or the factory cannot get raw materials to the factory, or the factory cannot access a design team. And so therefore, you get that whole value chain operating next to the factory. Like Penang has that opportunity. The multimedia super corridor that was set up in Malaysia, maybe a more optimized version of that would have been that it should have been set up near Penang. So then you have a Silicon Valley, both on the design side, the software side, and then you got the hardware all in one area. but we know the multimedia super corridor is more closer to Kuala Lumpur, and these are different things that we can debate about. What is the best government policy to attract FDI into Malaysia? And then, we talk about that for Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia if those questions do come up. But I just want you to get thinking about how can we make Malaysia a better place to attract FDI. And obviously either Johor, KL, Selangor Valley or Penang are these are things on the radar for FDI. And are we going to have tax incentives? Do we need to have more labor? Do we need to have design teams? Do we have to have we have more talent, but we need to pay wages to attract that talent to stay in Penang, to stay in Kuala Lumpur, to stay in Johor, and not be inclined to go to Singapore if they're on the software side, if they're on the design team side. These are the challenges that government officials, industry leaders in Malaysia need to grapple with. All right. So the total reasons influencing industries in China moving out are the geopolitical risks. The cost of production and logistics has been a push, but scope to improve the supply chain and close to market are things where you can roll out the red carpet, because Southeast Asia is close to the market. It's close to Southeast Asia market, and it's not just a place to have a factory alternative to China. And as I explained, considerations in terms of geopolitical risk made up 47%, but considerations from China, that is push factors, made up 25%, incentives from the receiver market making up 25%. All right. So let's just try to bring this home from the macro point of view. And, there's a lot more graphs there, and I don't want to bore you with too much data. And we could predict, going to Vietnam. Can we predict going to Thailand, India, Mexico? And you can see on the green, the big push or the traction for going to Vietnam was the green area, and that is geopolitical risk, but also the cheaper land and labor. But going to India, it was the tax incentives and having a larger footprint. As I said, larger companies with a larger supply chain footprint tended to go to India rather than Vietnam. Or if they went to Vietnam, they also went to India, like what Apple is doing. But going to Mexico, it was all about being close to the market or already having an established factory. And as I said right early on, going to Mexico is not just a straightforward strategy, because you do have different cultures, you do have different regulations, you do have different ways and different skill levels that you have to manage. It's not just the same as the skill levels that you would find in Vietnam and other areas in Southeast Asia. So there's some summary what I want to take you to take away tonight. And I want to move over to what implications are there at the cost level for running factories, or the challenges for running factories in the region? Because the big question that you may ask, and you're representing AICPA, you're representing AICPA, I want to move to the micro side, and that is, okay, if we're going to set up a factory in Malaysia, we're going to set up a factory in Vietnam or Indonesia or somewhere, there is a few areas that I think that do not change from actually running the factory in China. And I just want to bring to your attention, and when we do have questions, I want you to be open and think about, okay, I have a question about the macro side, or I have a question about the micro side. But I just want to share another PowerPoint slide and stop sharing my first slide, and we can come back to that at any time. So I make sure that, are you all seeing this slide where I'm looking at AI in Asian manufacturing? Can you all see this? Yes or no?
Yes.
All right, that's great. So the reason why I want to show you this is I want to bring this back to a micro level and just pretend that, okay, we've moved some of our capacity out of China and we're going to Vietnam, or we're going to Malaysia or Indonesia, we're going to Southeast Asia. And I don't want to put Malaysia in the same box as Vietnam. Obviously, Malaysia is much more developed in terms of the skill set and the different types of population of labor that we can use when we set up a factory here. Ecosystems are different too. But something that is I want to bring to everyone's attention. So let me just swap my presenter view. And that is that if we want to think about, no matter which country we're moving to, we need to think about ultimately there is Industry 4.0 on the horizon. And yes, we can move to another country, but we still may be in the first stage of documenting the process or trying to get continuous improvement in the new country. And the big thing that I have witnessed through my endless visits to factories in China was the challenge of the owner mindset. And I've basically witnessed the same. I visited the Selangor HR Development Council, which is just about 7 kilometers west of here, Monday this week. And they were explaining about the challenges they were having in digitalizing the factories in Selangor Valley and other areas in Malaysia. And a lot of those factories weren't even at the stage of continuous improvement, even before they even think about digitizing or Industry 4.0. And what do we mean by continuous improvement or even documented processes? I just wanted to show you that when we go into factories...
so we're going to have a look at the SMT line now.
And what you have are two distinct factories. Now, these are in China, and they could be easy in any other country in Southeast Asia, and you're probably thinking, oh, I've seen stuff like that before in factories in Malaysia. Maybe you have. But I just want to show you that both of these factories are making the same type of product, headphones. But the factory at the bottom is quite often is what you see in Southeast Asia too, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, maybe in Indonesia too. Much more of a workshop. And the factory at the top is something where we want to get factories in Malaysia too. And some factories in Malaysia are probably at that stage where they're much more focused on the quality management than the factory at the bottom. Because the big difference between these two factories is that the factory at the bottom has a higher percentage of rejects because they really haven't documented out the work processes in order to manage the waste. And this being a cost management or a cost accounting, management accounting type seminar, this is a big thing on our horizon. That is, yes, we can go and digitalize both these types of factories. We can put robots into both of them, but none of that matters if we cannot reduce the waste. And what you see in these blue buckets below is the waste coming off the assembly line of the factory below. And you can see the factory above has a much more command over the waste because they have set up much more documented approach and systemized approach to continuous improvement. At the same time, the environmental management on the social side, because we have these vacuum hoses taking away any fumes that would come out from the worker process, especially if they are doing soldering. And the same thing for two other factories.
There you have it. Yeah, this is a fact.
Two factories, again, making exactly the same product, but the factory at the top has actually gone through a continuous improvement stage where the factory at the bottom has not. And this is, when I go into factories, and we were talking to the friends out at the Selangor HR Development Council, they're at the stage of actually training factory owners to actually go from the factory at the bottom stage to the factory at the top stage, where you first of all need to continuously improve the processes and get the processes systemized even before we start to think about how we automate and how we mechanize what's going on in the factory. And as you can see at the factory at the top, now they can automate parts of the assembly line because they've set up the system in place to be automated. And they could go to the next stage where a machine can take over some of these processes because the automated assembly line is now in place, whereas the factory at the bottom is not even there yet. So this is the stuff that I think that factory owners are, one of the biggest barriers. And when we talk about the costing, a lot of it is in the mindset of the owner to invest in the machine that the factory at the top on the receiving of raw materials is using, whereas the factory at the bottom is basically trusting that the supplier has done that checking for them of the exact same power cells that goes into the exact same product, the 20 power cells that go together to make the 4.4 amp hour battery that goes into the hoverboard. Well, it takes a factory at the top, a factory owner's mindset to say, all right, I want to invest the 100,000, the 200,000, the 300,000 ringgit in this machine because I believe that we can set up the continuous improvement around it to exploit, and therefore we can have a much more control over the waste from that process, and then we're going to save money through that process because the waste is lower, because we have much more transparency of what's going on, and then we can identify where the problems are, and then that's how we can recoup our costs. If I'm a cost accountant, the conversation I need to be having is with the owner about the benefits that they would have for installing machines like you see in the factory at the top. So I just want to show you one last factory that if we were to put in much more continuous improvement processes, then this is we first need to document, which a lot of factories are already doing. Great, this is the paper documentation, but we need to get that digitalized. And here's an example of where that documentation is showing that I need to find that problem because the chip goes in and doesn't line up with the PCB board at the back, and that could be due to the screwing in process, which I'm going to the operator that is managing that screw in process. That could be replaced by a robot, but even before that happens, that operator should have a cradle to make sure there's no variation in that screwing in process. Or if we go around to another operator who is doing the soldering, yes, that could be replaced by a robot, but even before that, that thing that is soldering should be put into a cradle so it doesn't move as he is doing the soldering. And as you can see, this is the micro things that need to be paid attention to if we're going to reduce waste in the factory, if we're going to move from the documentation stage to the continuous improvement stage. And that's where you're going to see cost improvements. That's where you're going to see waste reduction. That's where you're going to see contributions to an ESG strategy, even before you start to digitize, even before you start to put machines in the factory. So I just really want to give the audience tonight an insight into this. I'm not here just to talk about the macro side of things tonight. I'm happy to talk about the macro and the micro, and just to show you that at the macro stage, yes, there are different reasons why companies are going to different countries. And so at the policy level, governments need to understand the incentives that work, the ecosystems that need to be in place, the labour that needs to be in place, the training that needs to be in place to make a factory viable, and to make a factory and a continuous improvement in that factory viable, whether it is Malaysia or Indonesia, whether it's Vietnam or Thailand, Cambodia or India. Then on the micro strategy side, we're thinking much more in terms of the owner mindset. We're in terms of getting the stage of the factory from a documented stage to a continuous improvement stage. Then we can move to Industry 4.0 and actually start to learn and take advantage of what the Selangor HR Development Council is doing, like you see on this slide here that was taken just 4 days ago, where they're training people to actually code in JavaScript that helps to manage the API that manages the actual machinery, which is a micro version of that in those little cases that you see in this slide on your screen. So I just want to give you both the macro and the micro, because I can see that I want to spur your curiosity and your attention. That is, okay, if you are a cost accountant, if you are at the micro level, that doesn't mean that you cannot contribute to the macro policy. If you are involved in local government, if you're involved in a local industry council, and you want to give your voice to the government in your area, that doesn't, and if you are at the macro stage, that doesn't mean you cannot be involved at the micro stage and actually speak to, okay, where different factories are at, vis-a-vis documentation, continuous improvement, or Industry 4.0. So thank you so much for the platform that AICPA and AICPA are giving me this evening. Happy to take questions and to continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? I think this is the first question. When did the moves took place? When you were on this slide?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. What you'll find is that for India and Vietnam, the moves really spread out over from 2018 all the way to 2023. And for India and Vietnam, they have been quite constant. Whereas for Brazil, it is been much more recent. Brazil and Mexico have much more been in the last from 2020, 2021, 2022, and planned moves in 2023. That's a very good question, Nat.
Thank you. The second question we have is from Eric. Is decentralization process contributing to the supply chain bottlenecks we are experiencing?
Absolutely. That's a very good question. Yes. If you asked me in 2018 or 19, we're thinking of moving to another country or decentralizing out of China and say, oh, okay, let's set you up in Vietnam. Whereas, and at that time, the dominant strategy to go to Vietnam was, oh, Vietnam is much cheaper. But right now, Vietnam is not cheaper than China. Actually, in some ways, Vietnam is more expensive than China. And so the moves to Vietnam now are basically a geopolitical risk diversification strategy. Wherever you talk about 5 years ago and before, the moves to Vietnam are really dominated by, we need to decentralize our footprint because we see costs going up in China 15% every year for the last decade. And we need to diversify. Now, the inquiries that my associates are getting in Hong Kong and in Vietnam, associates that are giving consultation and advisory, is people are ringing them up every week now and saying, how do we get to Vietnam? And they don't care what the cost is. How fast can we move to Vietnam? So they don't even care about the cost anymore. So is this decentralization process contributing to supply chain bottlenecks? Absolutely. Right throughout the region, within 50 kilometers of any major urban center, warehouse prices have gone through the roof. Warehouse prices have gone up, like ginormously. And that's one indication of the supply chain bottlenecks. Why? Because if you cannot get what you are manufacturing onto the ship because the ships are not coming back from the US fast enough, where do you put your inventory? You put it into a warehouse. So where do you put it into a warehouse? Close to your factory, close to an urban center, or close to a port. Great, they are filling up. So where do you do now? Then you've got to build new warehouse. So, the fact that warehouse space is hard to come by is a sure indication that the bottlenecks are still around. Shipping rates have come back. They have already peaked and they have started to go down now, which is a good thing, but warehouse space is hard to come by. Next question.
Next question from Muhammad Sadek. What's the main differences or advantage of having contract manufacturing versus having a factory?
The main, huge, all right? The advantage of having contract manufacturing is that the manufacturer already knows what to make for you. You've already pre-selected that factory because you know they've made something similar for another customer, and that customer may be in another country, maybe in your country. All right, so you already know. So that reduces a huge risk in selecting the right factory. But if you set up your own factory by yourself, yes, you have full control, you have IP protection, but it's going to take you longer. It could take you 12 months, 18 months to set up a factory in a new country run at rate for the first time. And that's a long time. And it's Dyson basically uses Flextronics as its OEM manufacturer. And I think Flextronics is also the OEM manufacturer for Bissell, and that's something I need to check on, so I can't confirm that one. That's a very good question. So
thank you.
The advantage for OEM is you already have a ready factory, but it might cost you 20-30% more. The advantage of your own factory, you have the advantage of having a proprietary product or a proprietary design that no one in the world has seen, and you can bring to the market, and you have a 1 year leapfrog on all your competition. And 20% cheaper,
But it takes longer.
Oh, absolutely. 12 months, 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah. And you need to do trading. The next question is from Dr. Ramesh. And he's suggesting maybe you could use Porter's Diamond to provide another perspective of why companies are moving to other countries. I think that's just a suggestion.
Dr. Ramesh, all suggestions are great suggestions. I hear where you're coming from, Dr. Ramesh. I totally agree with you. Porter's Diamond, there are the different factors that are impacting on why you're located in a particular country. The competitive, the value chain being affected by your competition, by your suppliers, by imitators, and by the other factors. The Porter's Diamond, absolutely, totally agree that could be applied. Yes, I wanted to keep it simple in terms of getting back to the reasons for the move. That is, there are push factors and there are pull factors, because when you're actually talking government policy or you're talking to people in charge of industry, sometimes it's easier to speak to them in terms of the push and pull factors. But Dr. Ramesh, I'd love to follow up with you more, so really love to get your contact. Please do email me or send me your contact and follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have some questions from the chat, which I'm going to open up and I'm going to share the screen. Oops.
Yeah.
Okay. Panjev, probably. Okay. So Pankaj, I'm probably pronouncing it very poorly. How relevant is the role of ESG guidelines in terms of deciding the future of SCM? Which countries are going to gain by this?
Pankaj, this is a really good question, because a lot of the multinationals have been scratching their head in terms of navigating the ESG. Actually, one of the best indicators of whether a country has a good ESG guideline or not is follow the sourcing footprints of those major brand names who are very sensitive to the social media reputation risk. Okay, so for example, footwear and apparel, your H&M, your Zara, your Nike, your Adidas and your Puma, like they're so sensitive to especially the E and the S issues, and and all of them have had to decrease their footprint in China, partly because of the challenge of HR and Xinjiang cotton that's produced in the Xinjiang region in China. And then, you talk about many things, but number one, the big thing that's in the media at the moment is the sourcing of cotton. All right. So China makes 6 million tons of cotton a year. India makes 6 million tons of cotton a year. India, 6 million tons. USA, 4 million tons per year. In China, the Xinjiang region makes 5 million tons. That is 5/6 of China cotton. So you are really pulling your hair out if you are a H&M and you're sourcing from China and you put your garments into a container and send it to Los Angeles, and the customs at LA say, prove to us that the cotton in your garments did not come from the Xinjiang region. And that's a really tough thing to prove, even if it didn't come from Xinjiang. You went to another region and you sourced the other 1 million tons capacity. So that's the bind that the footwear and apparel are having. So they go to Vietnam for that reason, and then they're importing cotton from India, they're importing cotton from China, and then putting it into garments, footwear in Vietnam. So that's what they're doing. The ESG, the environment is a challenge in most of the Southeast Asian countries because, number one, factories naturally pollute the water in terms of, okay, they're going to have they use water to exchange heat. Most factories do that. And so that used water becomes polluted, no matter whether there's toxins in it or not. It's gone through a heating process, so it's going to go elsewhere. So there is an environmental risk associated with the water that any factory uses. But then you can look at the carbon footprint side of the E of a factory, and that is, how efficient is it operating in terms of the electric footprint, electricity that it is using. So water and electricity is the big gauge of factories when it comes to the E, in the E and S and G. And I'd say that in some water and the water and electricity, that's something that's going to be par of the course, no matter if the factory is in Malaysia or Indonesia, anywhere in Southeast Asia. But the S in the S and G, this is something that will differ across the Southeast Asian economies because of the different immigration policy, because of the different visibility that factories must provide on their labour hiring practices. And so that's something that is going to be driven either by government guidelines, NGO stakeholders, industry groups, or the large multinationals, because they worry about their reputation risk. And at the moment, I think the NGOs, which are leaning on the large multinational, for example, the Mekong Group out of Hong Kong is leaning on the multinationals in terms of modern slavery. That's a big example. And then the old multinationals themselves, being much more aware of their reputation, are thinking much more on the social side. So very good question. But I think the S and the S and G is going to have much greater variance across Southeast Asia than the E in the E, S and G. Very good. Sorry for the long answer to that question. That's something much more examination of that across the region can be done, and so therefore governments could actually better formulate their policy in terms of how they attract multinationals and FDI into their own country. Next question. It seems Malaysia is losing out to its neighbours. I'm just reading on the chat here. Do you want me to go through?
Thank you. Thanks, Professor. The next question we have is from, wait, let me see. From Rajita. With the current shifts, how does those companies could maintain the lean approach they have been maintaining for high volume products?
Rajita, that's a very good question. And when you say a lean approach, yes, that was the approach that came out lean approach mainly just in time. You minimize the inventory, and you're able to do that up until 2020 because you really didn't need to carry inventory, because you can put stuff directly onto ship or into the belly of an aeroplane. 27,000 planes around the world, and half of their capacity is the belly for freight. So the lean approach did work. It did work for the electronics companies to just put consumer electronics in the belly of aircraft and fly them around the world for sale. But now, in 2020, you had 27,000 planes grounded except for the freight carriers, and they only carried 50% of the freight around the world, and so there was bottleneck there. So therefore the lean approach went out the window. Supply chain resilience became the new norm, and that is, it's an inventory approach. You need to make for inventory because the stock out costs are too expensive. You cannot afford to be without stock. Otherwise, you will lose out to your competition. And so that's what the companies had to change over to. Yeah. Next question.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Aswan Omar. It seems Malaysia is losing out to its neighbors, notably Vietnam. Having said that, judging from the current situation at home front, the government, i.e. MITI, could come out with great incentives to compete with its neighbors. However, why Malaysia couldn't attract more than this multinational despite advantages Malaysia has at the moment, i.e. infrastructure, talent, and so on? I think you addressed that.
Yeah, briefly addressed it. I think the big thing that Malaysia could do, or it was a mistake, but something that can be rectified, is they should have located the multimedia super corridor in Penang. In other words, you create a concentration of the whole value chain, and then that would attract more capital into that same area, and then things just multiply like that. So it's not everywhere in Vietnam that is attractive to multinationals. The multinationals that are making electronics are not really attracted to Ho Chi Minh City. They're attracted up north. Why? Because Hanoi and their government are setting up technology parks and the ecosystems for the Samsungs, for the Apples, to really set up the factories for manufacturing of consumer electronics.
Mm-hmm.
Penang and Johor, like Malaysia, really needs to beat the drum on those locations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The next question is from Tunis. Do you see any shift in the services sector, for example, global call and services center, and what role did COVID play in the shift of manufacturing and also the shortage of raw materials? That's 5 questions.
That's interesting. Do you see any shift in the services sector? The services sector, so the one that is immediately located next to supply chains would see the biggest shift, and that is the 3PLs. That is all of the services that surround getting to the factory, from the factory, shipping, and all the logistics to the final consumer. Right, so you'll find that, and I would see the shift in the service sector expanding when port capacities expand. So for example, the services sector, because China has 170 million TFU port capacity, you see that the service sector is naturally going to be associated with that capacity. If Malaysia and Vietnam only have 10 million each, you can see the constraint on services sector. Like, if there's no more throughput going through the port, then services sector is going to be limited with that, with services associated with the logistics, with the throughput going through the port capacity. So we want the port capacity to expand. We want infrastructure getting from factory to port. Penang naturally has that, all right, factory to port, factory to airport. All right, and that's something that can be expanded. Johor has that opportunity to expand. India's getting that because now Apple is locating in India, and it's just going to help expand the ecosystem. So the services will really follow that, the infrastructure that is attached to getting stuff from A to B and the logistics. I know there's a few questions there, but that's my best, I think the most poignant answer I want to give with what's going on with that service sector. If you talk about the shift of manufacturing, the COVID really played a part in terms of border closures. Basically, COVID gave a lot of uncertainty, because back in 2020, there was just a big uncertainty with, started in China, and then you had the MCO here, and like factories didn't know when they're going to reopen. Like, it's all good for the service sector to say, oh, let's have a work from home, and that's all well and good, right? But the factory cannot have a work from home policy. And so for China, they didn't know that factories didn't know what they were doing, because they would say, oh, if factories can reopen, great. But then what would happen is that only 50% of the staff could come back. Why? Because of some of the staff that went home, they went back to a city or a province, and they found out over that weekend that province was under lockdown, and so therefore they couldn't travel back to the factory, even though there was nothing wrong with the workers vis-a-vis whether they had COVID or not. It's just that they weren't allowed out of their province to come back to the factory to work. So, these were the logistical issues of getting factory personnel back to the factory. And that's the big role that COVID played. It just created uncertainty for the factory to stop, start again. Shortage of raw materials, same thing. Like the shortage of raw materials, not so much the COVID, was much more that when you do have a relocation, you need to think about where your raw materials going from. A lot of footprints that went down to Vietnam still relied on raw materials from China. And then that's great if you're up in Hanoi, because you're a 12-hour truck ride south of Shenzhen and Guangzhou, the largest electronics ecosystem in the world. But what about for Hanoi? Sorry, what about for Ho Chi Minh City, where you're more reliant on shipping of the raw materials, or air freight, where you better hope that the planes are flying from the factory in China down to Ho Chi Minh City and not being locked down by COVID?
There are a few more questions. I just want to check with Nisa. Do we have time for? Do we still have time? Are we good to go, Nisa?
Hi, Gary. Yes, we still have time? You can proceed.
Okay, great. The next question is from Muhammad Ramzan. What's the role of raw material availability, country inflation, and currency devaluation when deciding about moving production to another country?
Oh, that's a very good question. All right, country inflation is number one. That's out of your control. Currency devaluation, you can manage that through hedging a risk, so then that becomes a financing decision. So it's really interesting that you mentioned that. It's a very good question. Raw material availability, that would dominate. You would never go to a country if you cannot get raw materials, whether you ship it in or not. Country inflation, it's out of your control, but that's going to be associated with the currency. And then you can manage that with financing instruments, assuming that that currency can be hedged against. So that's a very good question there.
Thank you. And the next question is from Clarence. How does the MNCs control and ensure quality of products are not compromised if they decide to go for contract manufacturing?
Oh, totally. Multinationals, like even Dyson, they would send their audit team in to audit the product, whether it's during the manufacturing process or at the end of the manufacturing process. It's the right of the customer to access the OEM manufacturing process at different stages. It's very clear in the contracting process that they have access to understand that there are quality gates in place, and also that the final product is the highest quality as per the standard, AQL standard, before shipping. So no, there's no problem with that. Yes, you can outsource to an OEM manufacturer, but that doesn't mean you have to outsource the quality check-in. You can outsource quality check-in to a 3PL, to an audit team, yes. And I've been working with a third-party auditor. I've done third-party audits of factories in China myself. So, that's very easily to be done. And so the assurance of the quality is no problem with that.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Muhammad Sadiq. Could you please elaborate on the microphase?
Yes, the microphase, because I really want to many of you are probably, I was assuming that, okay, the audience that we have here, it's some ways you're probably closer to the micro phase, and that is you might be working with procurement teams, you may be working with technical teams or quality management teams or engineering teams that are associated with product development and design. So therefore it's important that you have an understanding of the challenges that they may face. Ultimately, the big point I was going to make is the factories go through different stages of evolution, and you can say, like, the caveman part of the Neanderthal stage of the evolution is that the factory just documents what's going on in the assembly line, and then you have paper and pencil like I showed you in the video. But the next stage is where you actually have a much more systemized process, as you saw in the higher end speaker manufacturer AICPA, where all the operators were not facing the assembly line, they had their own setup, and above each operator they had fully documented task sheets for the operator to follow in order to make sure that they do everything correctly. And so that's where you go into a continuous improvement cycle once you get to there, and you start to find where, number one, bottlenecks are, where, okay, maybe you have 20 operators. And this happened I went to a scooter manufacturer where I could show you a video on pull up another video, where we saw the scooter manufacturer. You had one operator that was doing a special screw on the scooter, and then what happened was he would do that and then pass it on to the next operator. Most of the operators were male, that's why I'm saying he, right? And then the one before that seemed to be doing nothing. He would do the screw, and then he's just waiting there and he's playing with his iPhone, playing a game on his iPhone for the next scooter to come to that operator. That's an obvious bottleneck. So, you got someone doing something, but half their time is idle. And so therefore, the process before that operator you need to highlight, and therefore maybe you need to put 2 or 3 people on the process before that operator. So therefore, when the operator finishes screwing, they only have to wait 5 seconds, and then the next scooter is delivered to them and they do the next screwing. 5 seconds, next scooter comes, and so forth. So that when we start to get to the micro stage, we are documenting, we're just looking for the workflow. We're looking for, number one, we're looking for processes that cause waste. Like, I've gone into one factory where they were doing their soldering, and then the worker would pick up what they just soldered and they would throw it onto the conveyor belt. Well, the act of throwing and then this PCB with newly soldered wires on it landing on the conveyor belt, that force is enough to cause a reject. All right, so, or the variation in the soldering, right? Identifying those processes where you can actually reduce the causal factors impacting on the reject, and then you minimize your waste. So you're minimizing bottlenecks, you're minimizing waste, and that's where you get to moving from a documentation stage to a continuous improvement stage. And you will find that the cost implications will take care of themselves once you start focusing on what you see in the factory. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. Thank you for the explanation. We have another few questions.
By the way, as I'm doing the questions, can we have a show of hands or a boo 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 because I'm not helping you? Are my answers helping you? I can only assume they are, but I'd like to know by a show of hands or something like that. I think that would be great. AICPA would like to know if this is of benefit to you. Okay, thank you.
I think some people are raising their hands, and we
That's
did
good.
have a thanks from one of the person who asked a question. Yeah. Professor, can you see the raise of hands? I'm not sure. I don't think I can see it.
That's all right. If you see it, I believe you. Thank you. John Lane, I'm just looking at the chat room at the moment in terms of questions.
Okay. There is another question from Mohammad Zahid Hussein. Investors seems to be not very interested in relocating to Bangladesh, while Bangladesh has many incentives for foreign investors. Any particular reasons for that?
That's interesting, right? Because, and I probably don't know everything about Bangladesh, and because Bangladesh was number 2 in terms of apparel exports worldwide, and then maybe Bangladesh, or maybe companies have decentralized away from Bangladesh, especially the apparel footwear, partly because of maybe the social aspects and getting visibility to make sure that the worker conditions are up to scratch. So, you know, there may be other elements that I'm not aware of, but, you know, the big thing today, if Bangladesh were to attract, even like every country in Southeast Asia were to attract, was to make sure worker conditions are so critical these days compared to 5 years ago. The S in the ESG is much more critical than it was 5 years ago. And yeah.
We don't have any more questions, Professor. Is there anyone who wants to unmute themselves and ask a question?
I'm going to put my email into the chat room and also LinkedIn, so please do reach out to me. Happy to help. Oh, I just sent that to Ramesh, but I'll send that to everyone.
Anyone has any questions? Any more questions?
Hi, Karen. I think Eric Oy is raising his hand. I guess he has.
Oh, yes. Okay, Eric. Go ahead, ask your question. Oh, he went off.
I was raising my hand because you said raise your hand if you appreciate it.
Okay.
That was the reaction. Sorry. That was
All right.
question.
Thank you. I have a question. When you took the videos in the factory, right, and that was really interesting to see the differences between, you know, a good quality manufacturer and, you know, something that is not of very with continuous improvement, right? Do they know that you're going to show it globally, and, you know, is that going to be a problem for us to, you know, for this recording? Just
No,
that, you know.
Totally, not at all. Like, number one, these it's really interesting that I do approach these companies, and I tell them, look, I want to use it for teaching. I want to use these videos to share with industry. I'm going to share this with buyers in the region in public events. Especially, I've been sharing these videos as part of my presentations for Global Sources for the last 5 more years. Because, and I do explain to them, is number one, if I take video, I give you a copy of the video, you can use it to highlight your factory, you can use it to promote your factory and give much more visibility to your factory to buyers. And I've had buyers contact me and say, oh, I want to source from the factory in your video, and then I just pass on their contacts. So I do the other thing what I do when I visit the factory is I give pro bono advice. Just get into a boardroom and start to give them ideas and my observations. And as you saw in the video, we actually showed where they were making errors in terms of the screwing and the soldering. I was giving advice to the owner on that day about, you know, this is how you can improve different aspects of your operations, like just a little mold to hold, a little cradle to hold that thing you're soldering so it doesn't wobble while you're soldering. Maybe a little bit more comfortable seat for the worker so the worker doesn't move as he's doing this soldering. Like, these things are not expensive. For just these little micro improvements can make the world of difference for the factory. And so, you know, I don't go in there as the world's leading expert and you need to have a robot to make your factory better. I try to give them advice to, here's how you can improve to the next step based on where you are at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And do they actually go for training, any specific training that these factory workers go to, you know, help improve?
That's a very good question, like training. I think that, you know, I step back and look at the scores of factories I've been to, and I think training is it's a huge underestimated resource and investment. It's an investment, it's not a cost. Huge, huge, huge. And that was a great thing, like I saw at the Selangor HR Development Council, where we just saw that's all they do is training. Companies go to that council and say, oh, can we have an off-the-shelf product to fix our factory so we could go to the next stage in Industry 4.0? And they say, sorry, we're not going to give you an off-the-shelf product. We want you to start training your workers and we're going to help you do the training. And I think it's a change in mindset that you can just buy out the change that you need to have happen in your factory. You just need to invest in the people that you have in the factory. And yeah, so that's, you know, we all know, you know, the big challenge in Malaysia, that the wage levels are a huge challenge to attract factory workers and to skill them up, worried that they may leave. But if you are in an ecosystem, that's where the government can play a role, like you're in Penang, like you're in Johor, you don't mind if you train them up and they're skilled and they leave, because you know that the pool of labor in that area is the skill set of all the pool of labor is going up, and then you can source from them. But you know, some of the little challenges in Selangor is that you pay a factory worker 2,000, 3,000 ringgit per month, but the same worker can go and work for Food Panda and get 4,000 per month. You know, that's a challenge when you're kind of outside of a huge ecosystem or a stronger ecosystem like you may find yourself in Penang.
Thank you. We have Muhammad Sadiq raising his hands. Sir, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. Thanks a lot for your patience and your efforts. Thanks a lot. Very, very highly appreciated. Just a quick one. The first one, you kindly elaborated about the microphase, and it looks like, as per my understanding, it's a phase for improvement the process and going in deep details of analyzing each process, although it's a small, rather, and the sequence of this process. And it's like a part of the continuous improvement tools, I would say. Is there other phases like macro phase, micro phase, and then a high quality improvement, or what other phase? Or this is the main phase for leading the change and quality improvement? This is the first question.
Yeah,
The
let me
second
just
question.
like here are the main phases, because last year I did some study on, okay, Neil, you've been to all these factories, and if the question came up of, well, you know, how can AI help? And the answer to this is no. The factories in the region, in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia or China, they do not need AI to make the improvements that they can make. What they do need is first of all, clear documentation of processes. Okay, so, and that starts with documenting the quality of incoming materials, documenting processes, right? And then go into a phase where you're much more aware of, number one, the wastage that's occurring in the factory. Where does it occur? What are the causes of the wastage? And number two is, where are the bottlenecks? And how do you learn about that? It may be that you bring in a third-party auditor who has factory expertise in your product area. You pay them 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 ringgit to come in over a week to do an audit of the factory to find out where are the processes that we can improve for the bottlenecks, reduce the wastage. Any factory worth their mind of wanting to be around, you know, in the long term in Southeast Asia, every factory should be at least doing that. You know, you pay 1 month of a worker's salary to a third-party auditor to come in for 2, 3, 4 days to do an audit. Any factory will benefit 10 times from if you are able to implement what the audit revealed. Yep.
Thank you.
Muhammad,
Yes, thank you.
you had another question, right?
Yes. You kindly talked about moving from China, and it has a lot of questions regarding moving from China. What would be Chinese reaction? And if they implement new incentives, do you think moving back to China will be an easy thing? And by a way or another, doctor, the COVID thing somehow showed the importance of having a localized manufacturing to avoid any block borders, etc., etc. So are we going to see a major change in the world rather than having new China? Now, moving to India may lead to having a new China. Maybe moving to Vietnam may lead to having a new China. You got what I mean. So how do you see this would go in the near future? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, two really good questions. Your first question is answered by the data. In other words, based on the data of the publicly documented moves, very few companies are leaving China. All right, so companies are not leaving China with the idea that, oh, one day I'll go back to China. No, they're not. 45 US companies are documenting the move in my data. Only 5 have sort of closed the door on China. All right, so that's not a major trend that's happening. So therefore, I think the companies I've documented, most of the public companies, they're smart enough to know that leaving China for good is not a sensible strategy. Okay. The second one is, how has COVID changed the new normal? I would say that COVID has changed the new normal. Number one, all of us, our management accountants in the audience especially, remember we're balancing just in time with stock out costs. I think that is I think that's chapter 17 of Horndren Cost Accounting. You could correct me there, Nisa. Yeah. But, you know, it was always just in time was a viable strategy. Why? Because the cost of stock out was never on the horizon. Why? Because some catastrophe occurring only occurred once every 5 years or once every 7-8 years. For example, the 2011 Japan tsunami, the floods in Thailand, the earthquake in Mexico, and different places. Like, on average, when you're giving advice to multinationals when they're locating the factories, you have to risk in the fact that you need to factor in that you will be shut down on average for 2 weeks every year, that you're going to be in any country outside of your own. All right. So that's the general advice I give and senior advisors give to multinationals locating supply chains, even before COVID, that you cannot assume that you can find a country that you will not be disrupted for, on average, 2 weeks per year. All right. And so maybe that disruption happens once every 5 years. So therefore, that's 5 times 2. You're going to be disrupted for 3 months every 5 years in any country you're in. But what the COVID has done, it's changed that. It's changed that to, you're going to be disrupted every year now, no matter which country you're going to be in. Why? Not because of natural disaster. It's because that governments may put in border closures. They may put in an MCO. Like, these are additional factors that we never ever thought about in the past century, because the last time there was a need for this, well, maybe for a brief period when there was, 2003, the COVID back in 2003, I was in Hong Kong at that time, that was the last major disruption caused by a pandemic. At how small it was, but it was large at that time for the last century. So this is the new thing that COVID's brewing. It's an extra factor of disruption. And so now all multinationals, no matter who you are, where you are locating, you need to factor in maybe 2 weeks more of disruption every year. So now it's 1 month of disruption you need to factor in. And you just got to assume that that's part of the risk, no matter which country you choose. So that's what COVID has done to change the risk landscape. I hope that answers.
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot.
Most welcome.
We have no more questions. Oh, there is one more question from Dr. Ramesh. If it is a gray rhino risk, then applying Tara strategic stock holding would have helped. That's just
okay. So grey rhino, you mean black swan, like once in a blue moon risk. Apologies, my brain is a bit full, so I'm not sure what Tara strategy means, but I will not disagree with your sentiment there. Thank you.
Dr. Ramesh, you want to comment on your question, on your suggestion?
Yeah, should I unmute and then answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I meant was, there are two sort of risks. There is one we call as Dr. rightly said, black swan. Okay, so that is an unexpected event and it has got a huge impact. Okay, but then Gray Rhino, Michelle Walker, in her theory, in her book, Michelle Walker goes on to say, Gray Rhino is something which is coming towards us. Okay, these are the changes which we see in this world. Okay, and this Gray Rhino, it is slowly moving towards us and it's going to hit me. Okay, if I'm aware that it's a Gray Rhino risk, then probably using this Tara strategy, once again quoting from SEMA only. Okay, so risk management. See what happens is, as India does. Okay, I'm speaking from India. India does hold some strategic reserves, say crude reserves. Okay, abroad. They're not having it in India, but they are having it abroad. Okay, in many other countries. So one way of reducing, okay, say probably in the supply chain, say constraints. If you are able to anticipate supply chain constraints, then probably Tara strategy, particularly to reduce risk. Okay, that 1R stands for reduce risk. Okay, there probably we could have used this Tara strategy.
If I can just comment on that, and look, totally agree. No issue with that. I think what generally happened, or what took companies unawares in the last 2 years, was that generally with risk management, you want to avoid the risk and you want to have contingencies in place to manage the risk. Well, what happened was very few companies had contingencies in place and very few companies were able to avoid what COVID presented, and most companies were in risk mitigation mode. And in other words, it's kind of too late to have a contingency in place or to avoid the risk. It's already here. So risk mitigation is, well, okay, we've just got to work with the extreme circumstances we're in. We need to move away from just in time to inventory. We need to go to another country, no matter what the cost. And actually, a lot of SMEs and multinationals that did not move footprint out of China to Vietnam, they're talking to my associate who's a 3PL in Hong Kong now. They're contacting him and saying to him, "Oh, how can we get to Vietnam?" And they don't even care about the cost. Whereas 3 years ago, anyone approached him who say, "Oh, how much does it cost to move to Vietnam?" So you can, COVID's just changed it all about. Cost has gone out the window in terms of the diversification strategy now, and you don't leave China because of rising costs. Costs are going up in Vietnam. They're going up in India. They're going up everywhere anyway. So when you go to Vietnam, you go to India, you're going there for the long term. You're not going there for 2 years, hope to go back to China when things pass by. No, you go to India because in the next 10 years, the infrastructure, the ecosystems are going to be in a much more modern state than they are today. But thank you for raising that Gray Rhino and strategy.
Incidentally, it's against the government policy. Government policy that India is getting its bullet train very fast, very soon, probably in a couple of years.
I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of all the infrastructure improvements in India, and governments in the region, they need to work hand in hand in partnership with multinationals. Governments cannot do it on their own. Multinationals cannot do it on alone. It needs a partnership, and more public-private partnerships can work wonders in changing the infrastructure landscape.
Thank you, Doctor.
Welcome.
So we do not have any more questions. I think we are coming to the hour. Should we do a quick photograph session, Nisa and Chirian?
Yes. So if everyone can open your camera. So okay. Okay, so If you all can just keep smiling while I capture. So thumbs up.
That's good. Oh yeah, thumbs up. That's good.
Okay, thumbs up. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Thank you everyone for coming to this session, and thank you, Professor, for such a wonderful and interesting topic. It really shows your expertise in this area, and now we know who to come to if you want to source from China. Yeah, so I hope everyone will have a great day, a great evening if you are in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. Thank you everyone, and I will see you in the next webinar. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, we will get a recorded video for this, please.
Yes, sure. We will be
Great.
sending the recording after the session.
Great.
And
Great.
see you all in
It's very
LinkedIn too.
valuable.
That'll be great. Appreciate you seeing in LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
Rob.
Bye.
Bye.
Prof,
Hi. Hi.
are you okay with sharing the slide also?
Absolutely,
Slides
no
to the
problem.
participants? Okay, so I
Yes.
will be sending the recording and slides to all the participants.
What I'll do is I'll give you a PDF copy to share, okay?
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.